I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is the Disorder Podcast, where we talk about the absolutely mad world we are in. And it has just got a little bit more mad.
It sure does, because on November 6th, 2024, annual inflation was 2.2%, unemployment was 4.1%. The price of gas on average at the American pump was $3.09. And yet, in a campaign for which inflation, employment, and the price of life, which is frequently translated as the price of gas, were seen as main things, the anti-incumbent populist won, and yet 2% is the target inflation rate, 5% unemployment is what is needed to have a flexible labor force, and gas is significantly cheaper than it needs to be to promote alternative energy. So, Alex, what happened? Why did this happen?
I woke up the day after the election, not devastated, but absolutely hopping mad. And I have had very difficult conversations with a lot of friends in the last 48 hours where we have disagreed vehemently about why Trump won and how the Democrats lost. And I just want to share with you that on the day of the election, I was in North Carolina and I spent an hour chatting to Democrats outside one polling station and a separate hour chatting to a different group of voters, Republicans, at a different polling station. And it just laid out for me 100% why the Democrats lost the election and why Trump won. The Democrats I spoke to, they were absolutely lovely. They were all white women, a little bit older. They were all very well educated, and they had all moved from Washington or Northern Virginia suburbs or from cities to retirement in a rural area. And although they skirted around the word, it was quite clear they viewed Trump voters as deplorable. In the end, they came up with the word uneducated. They also said they were racist, they were sexist, they were uninformed, they'd been taken in by the media. And their two flags by their observer station were pro-choice and a rainbow flag. And those were the issues that they were there talking about and worrying about what might happen if Trump won. At the Republican table that I visited, they had signs saying, Kamala open border, Trump closed border. Kamala crime, Trump safety. Kamala inflation, Trump better economy. And when we talked, they said they were worried about immigration, the economy, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the decline of US authority in the world, condescension from elites, out-of-touch Washington elites, political corruption in Washington. And I asked them about Ukraine, and this was the real moment where it sort of turned it on its head. Because one of the arguments that supporters of Ukraine have tried to use to persuade Americans as to why it's important to keep supporting Ukraine is, look, you're so worried about all these tax dollars being sent to Ukraine, but they're not. They're being spent here in America in defense industries. They're actually supporting American jobs. And this woman, who, by the way, was a PhD scientist, said to me, and that just drives me nuts. It's a complete racket. For years, we saw it on Iraq, we saw it on Afghanistan, and we're seeing it on Ukraine. There is this racket in Washington between these wars and defense contractors and lobbyists getting rich. So she interpreted it in a completely different way. Anyway, so why did Trump win and why did the Democrats lose? It's because Trump spoke to them on the issues that they care about in a way that they could relate to. And the Democrats are focusing on issues that aren't top of people's concerns.
I do agree with that analysis. I think that, as I've discussed in other earlier podcasts, there's a conspiratorial take back control the resentment of Washington elites, the us versus them stuff. You wrote an interesting article in the Byline Times that we're going to put in the show notes, and I'm going to quote you. They didn't vote for Trump because of his obvious flaws, his blatant misogyny, racism, foul mouth, criminal record, disregard for the law, and so forth. They voted for him despite these flaws. I disagree with that, Alex. I had the great and the good at my watch party here in London, and we came to an understanding that I kind of knew in 2016. There was something in the American character, and there probably was in the German character in the 1930s and in the Hungarian character 10 years ago, that is very attracted to deviance, you know? Those stupid elites, they impose these rules, they this and that. Well, I want to use the N-word, and I want to say that women are inferior, and I want to whatever. And it's not that they hate those things, they just love the sense of deviance. So it isn't because of the felony. You can't say that every Trump voter is a saint and that they just want to have lower inflation.
I totally agree.
When things are getting bad and rough and you feel constrained and there's more and more rules, you can't say this, you can't do that. Deviance is an attraction.
So the paragraph that you quoted from my Byline Times article, I ended that paragraph by saying, in effect, and I apologize, listeners, it was a big fuck you to the establishment. And there's kind of a finger up to all us smug, pompous, know-it-all, superior lot who've been talking down to these redneck hicks. But you don't get that many votes with everybody having that sentiment. I know plenty of people who are well-educated, would not think of themselves as racist or sexist, and they just voted Trump. They did not like what the Democrats were selling. I'm not trying to whitewash it, but I do think there's a problem for the Democrats if the debate and the post-mortem is these voters are all too stupid to know what's good for them. And it is going to be a problem for Democrats. And the burden is on us to try and find a way to reconnect and to find a way to engage and to put across that message more effectively.
And I ended the last episode saying, those who are culpable in this defeat should fall on their swords. I wouldn't mind if Kamala said, I was wrong. I shouldn't have run. I should have allowed there to be an open primary. I shouldn't have asked to be coronated when Biden stepped down. And those who have advised her to, for example, adopt a range of particularly intellectual and elite policies, I think they should say, you know what? We made this huge mistake. We're not going to be running future campaigns. And the Jake Sullivans of the world, I feel also have a lot to be blamed for. And I would love public mea culpas for that, as well as many people on the Israel policy and how these things were and were not triangulated. You and I both know it's not going to happen. Something about our culture, particularly center-left establishment culture, you don't come out and say, oh my God, I was wrong. We should have said X. But they should.
Well, I mean, the death blow was when Kamala Harris on The View, a daytime TV show that is quite popular, she was asked, was there anything she thought she would do differently from Joe Biden? And she said, no, I can't really think of anything. And over 70% of Americans, even if they're wrong about the economic facts that you were citing at the start of this, over 70% of them feel the country was heading in the wrong direction, and over 60% of them feel like they are worse off than they were 4 years ago.
We know that working people have felt the pinch since the pandemic. That's not a debate, and in a way, it's neither here nor there. What's interesting to my mind is that they think that tariffs on China will help them when it will only make many of the goods that they buy more expensive. You know what I mean? It's a failure of messaging. Biden was horrible at messaging. And I think that, as you agree, Kamala's message was too policy wonk crafted and doesn't resonate with people. And winning the debate was worth nothing. But just to pivot, there's also a different ethnic politics. Trump was able to have significant gains with minorities, with urban voters, with Arab Americans, particularly the men in those categories. So Hispanic men, black men. And we knew this was happening. Nate Silver and other pollsters have been explaining for more than a year that this phenomenon was coming. But the extent of the phenomenon is the complete realignment of American politics. And I would like you to draw on your British experiences, given that Brexit was a realignment, i.e., the Tories as the historically landowning and elite and more educated party have now switched into the anti-elitist party. You're a little bit further ahead in a transition in some ways. How do you view this shift whereby it's the Tories that have gone to a second minority leader, and Labour has essentially never had a female leader and never had a minority leader, and now the Republicans are getting to a position, although they do have just heterosexual white men at the top of their ticket, and we have had a black South Asian female, still there is a realignment in the ethno-sociopolitics of these parties.
Absolutely. I mean, you've just said it, Jason. Brexit and Boris Johnson broke the mold of British politics. And Donald Trump is doing the same in the US. And the Labour Party or the Democrat Party have now become associated as the party of metropolitan, college-educated elites. And the Conservatives and the Republicans are the working class, old Labour voting, old Democrat voting. I mean, the state of West Virginia is an absolute classic in point. This was solid Democrat territory for decades. They were coal miners, they were steel workers, they were rural people, and they identified Democrat unions. And over the years, it's moved steadily more rightward. And I think part of it is cultural. The sort of cultural changes in the world, the sense of jobs being lost to overseas, to Mexico and Canada in the NAFTA trade, and now to China. And I watched the World Series last week, and every single ad break, and as you know in baseball, there are ad breaks ad infinitum because the games go on forever. Every single ad break, the Republicans ran this spot that I just winced every time I watched it. But it was really brutal and it was very effective. And it showed a clip of Kamala Harris on an interview saying she supported transgender surgery for criminals in American jails. And it quoted her saying that. And then it flipped to a shot. And this was very ugly. And it sends shivers down my spine even now as I relay it because it's such ugly politics, showing athlete who had transitioned and was now a female athlete who was about 6'2" and very muscular, standing next to a group of small, petite female athletes. And it said, Kamala supports men playing in women's sports. Kamala is for they, them. Trump is for you. And it was like, oh. And that kind of stuff also, those kind of progressive causes have really turned off a lot of conservative voters. So yeah, there has been a shift in dynamics. Immigration is one, cultural wars is one, this woke stuff is one. And the conservatives and Republicans are riding that in a very divisive and repulsive way, I think, because they're picking on very vulnerable people. But Labour has lost touch with a lot of working class voters, and the Democrats have lost touch with a lot of working class voters.
I think Starmer handles these issues with a little bit more delicacy.
Much better, much better.
I'm going to make a point here, which is that the Republicans took the gloves off, and Trump represents the full taking the gloves off. He will say anything, attack anything, and this ad is the natural culmination of that. All you have to do is say, the opposing candidate cares more about someone transitioning in jail than about you and supports some man attacking your daughters during their soccer game. You know what I mean? Obviously, it's not true, right? But it's the complete lack of civility, anything to win. And to go back to the initial point that people voted for Trump because of the flaws, not in spite of them, I think it's because there is something in the American character that believes we did not use our hyperpower moment, meaning after the fall of the Berlin Wall, to maximally dominate. We could have extracted more value from Eastern Europe. We could have screwed it to those Africans. We could have, we shouldn't have necessarily invaded Iraq, but we could have just changed the global system in the Middle East. And why are we holding back? And the American character is not European. And there is something which is a unique appeal, not that there's not neopopulism in Europe. There is not only in Hungary and Poland, but elsewhere. But there's something that this really hits into a frontier ethos of pioneering Americans. It's not that you don't hit someone when they're down. It's that you extract value and you win. And arguably, Obama and Biden genuinely failed at that. And Americans may not even realize the extent to which this is true. But we have failed in the relationship with China when they were weaker in the 90s and 2000s. And we have failed in a whole range of things in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. So I guess this taking the gloves off approach is not only appealing, it's right in some way. The irony is that the Dems didn't succeed in explaining that the things that Trump proposes not only won't work, but will do the exact opposite of what is intended. In other words, as soon as he puts these tariffs on China, inflation is going to go through the roof.
I really like your point about the American pioneer spirit. I do think there is a kind of angry American sense that the world has been taking us for suckers, that we have been subsidizing defense, we've been policing the high seas, we've been upholding the international world order, and we're getting screwed over, and we've played too nice, and our enemies don't play nice, and our allies have ridden on our backs for far too long. And there is that sense of, we're just not going to be taken for suckers anymore. It's enough.
So, Alex, it is early to talk about the Dems rebuilding, and everyone is already talking about this. Where do we go from here? You were the one who was canvassing. You were the one knocking on doors. We kind of knew from, when I talked about the South Asians that I spoke to in New Jersey, and you talked about the doorstep knocking that you did. We both should have known this was going to happen.
Well, I give you credit, Jason, because we did an episode where you said you have this very uncomfortable worry that she's not the candidate and it's going to be 2016. And you were right. And after I did my first tranche of canvassing, I also had this worry that here I am in deep blue, which means Democrat here, deep blue territory of Northern Virginia, and I was not getting a great response on the doorstep. So I was thinking about, what do the Democrats need to do? When I was posted to Georgia, one of the things we used to do with political parties in Georgia, the democracy foundations would run these endless focus groups and polling of what was on the minds of ordinary Georgian voters. I'm talking about the Republic in the Caucasus. And over and over and over again, they said it was jobs and the economy. And Georgia's politicians, opposition politicians, talked about EU, NATO, democracy, freedom, human rights, and they didn't connect. And they have just lost another election in Georgia, a highly flawed election, I completely concede. And there are some serious issues in that country. But I would give Democrats the same advice that we were trying to give to these opposition candidates. Go out into the heartlands and talk to people about the issues that actually concern. Or maybe don't talk to them, listen to them. Listen to them. When I chatted to those Republicans in North Carolina, I just listened to them. I asked, why are you supporting Trump? And I just listened to them for an hour. And some of what they said made sense. I mean, they also said some awful things, like the two women there said, we also don't think a woman can be commander-in-chief. Foreign leaders won't respect a female. And I wish I had said,
and did you say
have you ever heard? Exactly. And it's like, the thought occurred to me, like, immediately after I said it, did you never hear about Margaret Thatcher? Anyway, sadly, I failed to make that point. But they need to go back to the drawing board. They need to go back and just get into the heartland and listen to voters. After the break, we'll talk about how are we going to survive the next 4 years. If it is 4 years, could it be more?
I would like to now pivot the rest of this episode to listener questions.
Good idea.
So, first question can be from one British former ambassador to another.
Oh.
From a former British ambassador to Libya, Dear Alex, with the Republicans controlling Congress, is it possible that Trump will attempt to change the Constitution to allow him to have a third term, just as so many African and Asian leaders changed their constitutions? Do we have to hold our noses for 4 years, or might it be until he kicks the bucket?
Oh my God. I'm trying not to allow myself to think it could get as bad as some people predict. I think Trump will go after the justice system and the institutions of government and the bureaucracy. I think there's going to be a purge. There's going to be a score settling. I don't know that he's going to try and change the Constitution. And I'm not sure he'd get away with it. So I don't think that's going to happen.
You can't change the Constitution in the United States without 2/3 of the states in their congressional delegations, and it's not possible.
Fine, that's a simpler answer.
He can further pack the court. He can eviscerate the justice system with lots of different court appointments and make it that power essentially resides with the billionaire class exclusively. Very difficult to change the Constitution.
All right, good.
I will also note that he is an extremely unhealthy man, and I would see him dying in his early 80s. And I don't think that his coalition is easily replaced by another leader. In other words, if you had DeSantis, even though DeSantis is way more articulate and far less of a felon, it might be that the coalition just falls apart because it's a cult and it requires Weberian charisma. It's not like you can just put DeSantis or Josh Hawley on top and then everyone will follow. It's about Trump himself.
I'll also make the point. I mean, American voters did actually vote Trump out 4 years ago. We have another election in 2 years' time. That may be too soon. But if Trump has control of the legislature, the executive, and for the time being, the Supreme Court, when they seriously fuck up, which is what they are going to do, and they allow Robert Kennedy to impose his wacky medical theories that lead to a health crisis, or they purge the bureaucracy and the system starts not working and they impose these tariffs and inflation goes up again, that will register with voters. Just like in the UK, the folly of Brexit has actually registered with voters now. It may not be easy to roll that back and undo it, but in the UK, they kicked the Conservatives out. They had had enough. So I don't think all is lost.
Yeah, I think that structurally the Republicans will eviscerate the checks and balances of government, but people will get fed up because they don't have any real solutions and they're going to cause just as much inflation as anyone else would, and people will get tired. And this flows quite well into the next question. Alex and Jason, here is a data point worth considering. In 2020, nearly 160 million people voted. This year, it seems that only 143 million did. That happened despite, or is it because of, the fraught nature of the election and its apparent stakes. It is worth noting that Trump received nearly as many votes as he did in 2020, although it was 2% less. But Harris received less than 85% of the votes that Biden did in 2020. In other words, she lost 15%. Why do you think this is so? Was there voter suppression? And is it just that Harris is an unbelievably flawed candidate? Or that people just don't care?
I want you to answer that one. I don't know. It's too early for me.
For me, it's what I said in the podcast before we had the Harris-Trump debate. I got myself too excited by that success in the debate, but I knew beforehand she doesn't excite people. She's a California liberal. We should have picked someone from the heartlands like a Gretchen Whitmer, and we should have picked someone who is actually not a lawyer. Because for a whole range of cultural reasons, someone from California and a lawyer and an elite plays into the Hillary Clinton, this is not our people. And they're just like, I don't want to vote for this woman. I don't care if she has the solutions. They're not attracted to her in the visceral sense that people who don't follow politics need to be to latch onto the charisma of someone. And yes, she has a nice laugh, but that wasn't enough. So 7 or 8 million people who might be traditionally Democrats just didn't turn out. And they're like, I don't know about this woman. And unfortunately, I thought that they might grasp that Trump is an existential risk to the democracy and to the future of their children and stuff. But they were just not necessarily attracted enough to her. I want to try to address the voter suppression piece. We don't know. The genius about stealth voter suppression is that on a micro level, people may have gotten things saying your polling booth is closing, or not telling them that the hours were extended, or, various vote drop boxes were closed early or difficult to get to, or in black areas there weren't enough polling stations. That's definitely gone on. I haven't read the deep data there, but I've heard about people who had to spend 8 hours on a line to vote, and those are in areas where there were lots of minorities and lots of possible Democrats. But I'm not an expert in that. I also think people haven't talked enough about the role of Russia and cyber ops. It was probably done in a much more nuanced way than in 2016 or 2020, and micro-targeting and whatever. And it's going to take months, if not years, to really get a sense, but that easily could have happened.
I would like to ask you a question,
Sure.
Which is, would Tim Walz have done any better if he was at the top of the ticket? Or do you think there was also just an anti-incumbency factor? And, that all of them would have suffered from this failure to understand how unpopular Biden had become. Do you think anyone could have done it better? I've seen people saying, if it had been a white man, he would have won, or I'm not 100% convinced.
I think the incumbency factor is correct, and you're right to not be convinced there. Waltz might have done marginally better because of his folksy element, but I don't consider him the most inspiring candidate. If we had run Michelle Obama, and I think Gretchen Whitmer as well, we would have won. I mean, that's just my view. I can't prove it. It's not scientific. I was saying that before. I mean, I think if Biden had said in 2022, I'm just a bridge candidate, let's have this primary, the having of the primary would have vetted things and let all these ideas come out, and we would have arrived at the one who had the most charismatic connection to people. The John Stuart Mill view about truth in the public square is that the more opinions are thrown out there, the one which is true sounds the best when it's tested against other ideas. The whole idea of democracy is when people begin to speak and debate and whatever, the ideas that are the best and the people who are the most charismatic and most attract people, their ideas will more appeal, and you'll coalesce around them. So if we had allowed a genuine market, I believe in markets, and we didn't allow a market of political competition within the Democratic Party, so we didn't get the best that our side has to offer. And I think that we should have allowed the possibility of also a national unity ticket. I've written about this question of the national unity ticket, where an Adam Kinzinger or a Liz Cheney would have been promised a cabinet role. And we should have had all those generals, Milley and McMaster and whatever, give some big speech like Rory and Alistair said, and have a huge ad thing with them. And also let some of those guys be guaranteed cabinet positions. So it would have just been the National Unity Party is competing up against the Trumpian Republicans rather than what we've done. Okay, next question. Given that the apocalypse is nigh, what can be done to minimize the damage Trump can or will do? How do we survive the next 4 years, Alex?
I was asked this at a panel earlier this year, and I used the analogy, which I apologize because I will use it again. When the container ship rammed into the bridge in Baltimore Harbor, one of the issues was it didn't have enough buffers around the pillars of that bridge. And we're going to have to try and figure out how to put buffers around our democracy. I think our politicians are going to have to be much more feisty. They're going to have to be willing to hit hard and really expose the flaws in this administration's policies and expose the hypocrisies. They're going to have to do what Pete Buttigieg did, which is try and take the debate to Fox viewers. They're going to have to go on Joe Rogan. They're going to have to go and meet viewers where they're at and take a much harder message. They are also going to have to mobilize. They're going to have to fight at the local level, the state level, and at the national level.
No Ming Vaz. This was too much of a Ming Vaz strategy.
Yeah.
And you need to take the gloves off. And yes, Kamala was a fighter on the debate stage, but we've not been structurally fighting. Biden could have used his time not only to potentially try to pack the court in different ways, but to create certain safeguards and to tip things, whether it's gerrymandering or, really dirty stuff, so that we don't lose and we don't in this position, because the Republicans are doing that. They are, taking advantage of every loophole, and therefore we just seem like suckers. And what we've learned is the American people doesn't like a sucker.
Yeah, and then I saw something last week. I can't remember who said it, but it was talking about media ownership and the media environment and the behavior of the big tech companies. And someone observed that they all know that if they piss off Donald Trump, they are going to get hit hard. If they piss off the Democrats, it's going to be a lot of hand-wringing, but there's going to be no consequence. I mean, it's been an unfair playing field. The Democrats need to get a little bit tougher, a little bit meaner, and a little bit more willing to hit back. And if you look at foreign policy of the Democrats administration, the Biden administration, it's all been about managing the conflicts, about not having them escalate. That's a problem. Americans didn't like that. And it's just extended these conflicts.
I called for Biden to go to the Knesset and say 5 Likud MPs need to resign and there need to be new elections. And then you're going to have a $100 billion deal, connecting Silicon Valley and the Israeli tech sector. And if you don't do it, we're not giving these arms, or we're doing this. Do you know what I mean? That the threats and carrots and sticks and creative hardball.
I mean, Biden still has 2 months. He could send those damn weapons to Ukraine, and he could try and use those last 2 months. I mean, Netanyahu knows he can now ride out the Biden administration. There's still a lot he could do.
He had more leverage a few months ago, but you're right. There are things that he can do, and now that he's not running the election, he should do what he thinks is right, because it's not about the media.
Yeah, and he could also, he's got 2 months, he can make appointments, he could try and get measures through Congress or regulations to try and strengthen agencies. There are things he could do. And he gave this very nice speech about, we recognize democracy and we don't hate the people who voted against us. And it was all very nice, but it's like, come on, guy, where's the fire? Where's the fire?
Yeah, well, apparently everyone is so terrified of being on Trump's wrong side. He has made revenge into a policy that works. By making revenge into a policy, he managed to get the Washington Post and the LA Times to not endorse Kamala because they were afraid of retribution. So now I'm going to read from the LA Times editorial. Today we must reckon with the harsh reality that authoritarianism has arrived in America, that it's broadly popular, and that millions of our fellow citizens have given it their votes. We are entering a dark and dangerous time, but while this is a moment of reckoning that we must acknowledge, we should also refuse to give in to despair and continue to assert and rely on our rights and protections as Americans. Do you agree, Alex?
I kind of feel that same angry American attitude could work against Trump as well as for him. I mean, Americans get pissed off, and they get pissed off when government screws things up. So maybe it'll come out again in 4 years' time in a different way. I don't think Americans like authoritarianism. They don't like big government. They don't like being bossed around, and they don't like being told what to do. So I'm slightly less pessimistic, actually, than the LA editorial, that everything is lost and it's all a complete disaster. I mean, he can do a lot of damage. I'm not trying to gloss over it. I am deeply worried about what he could do. It is definitely part of a populist trend. There is definitely an ugly side of politics coming out. But Americans don't like authoritarianism. Brits don't like fascists. They really don't. So if this administration goes in that direction and overplays its hand, it won't work for them. I don't think it'll work for them.
But what about how mealy-mouthed it is that this is the same LA Times that was unwilling to endorse Kamala, but then on November 6th it says authoritarianism has arrived in America. Aren't they going to get the same punishment from Trump for saying that? I mean, one of the things that I notice is Dems and liberal-leaning people say just enough that Trump hates them and revenges them, but not enough to really attack him. And not enough to really hurt him. So again, it's an example of us not taking the gloves off.
Well, the LA Times is pathetic. If they really thought a victory by Trump is an age of authoritarianism, and yet they weren't prepared to say that before the election, well, that's on them.
It's absolutely absurd.
It's pathetic.
Absolutely absurd.
I obviously sound really angry on this podcast. I am an angry American right now. I am an
I have
angry
a great one for you.
American.
Do you feel more American now than you did last week?
Yeah. I feel I have crossed that line, and I'm shocked at myself for saying so, but I left the UK and I felt deeply estranged from the UK after Brexit and 2019, and seeing where the Conservative Party has become. I haven't lost my European instincts, but I moved to America and have now acquired US citizenship. And I do feel American, and I still feel American. I haven't said, crikey, I wish I could go back to the UK, because the UK is still a place that I'm feeling a bit estranged from. I mean, the Sunday Times and Channel 4 produced this extraordinary report on the sources of finance of King Charles and the Prince of Wales. I mean, just extraordinary expose about how much they're charging hospitals, lifeboat services, the military, the city of Liverpool, ports, ferries, tolls. They own the seashore. They own the air between a boat and the seashore. I mean, the most shocking sources of income that they are making off the state and off public services, many of which they are the head of and the patron of. It was a huge story, and it's barely got a mention in the Daily Mail. And there's the Daily Telegraph back to saying, oh, Harry and Meghan's visa status in the US may come under question now that Trump is going to be president again. And it's like, really? I don't get this British mentality. And so I'm a Republican with a small r. I don't get the UK anymore. I don't get the monarchy. I don't get the House of Lords. I don't get the peerage system. I don't get where the Conservative Party is heading. So that was my cultural alienation, was from the UK. And I'm very sad about it because, of course, I love the UK. I grew up there and I represented the country. And I will say, I tried my best to represent the country. I was a loyal civil servant. So I have adopted America as my home.
Yeah, and I've had a corresponding evolution.
Yeah.
I feel the most British this morning that I've ever felt. Obviously, there's been a lot of tears over the last 72 hours, but I was watching something on Netflix because Foreign Policy Magazine has commissioned me to review the Netflix show, The Diplomat. And I think it's it's an abysmal program.
Yeah.
It's completely unwatchable. The acting is atrocious. The plot line is unbelievable.
It's absurd, yes.
The jokes don't make any sense. This is not how diplomacy works. You're not calling everyone on everyone else's phones, but whatever. There's that scene in the funeral where maybe they're playing Jerusalem or they're playing some very Britishy organ music in a extremely Anglican-looking church milieu. And somehow it just resonated with me. And I was like, yeah, this is very moving. And there's something about the reason that this resonates with me is I am British now. I've been living here the majority of the last 17 years. 17 years. I've been here probably between 9 and 11 of those years, if you counted the days, over those 17 years. And these symbols really resonate with me. And I have conversations and I think about this stuff as an American in exile. I'm an American by accent and I like American football and I find soccer very slow and boring. But I'm a Brit when it comes to many questions of lifestyle and certain cultural and social milieus and how they resonate with me. And when I'm at a dinner party, I'm going to prefer not asking certain questions and having a British reserve in certain things. And it's like, oh, I've chosen this. I prepared for this. I thought in 2018 that I needed to prepare for a second Trump term, and I was right. And I think it may be bizarre for the listeners to fully grasp this, but although I feel the struggle against Trump and disorder on the global level is my struggle, the specific struggle, say, in New Jersey, where shockingly Trump got 48% or 47% of the vote, that's not so much my struggle as I'm opting out of a particularly American parochial viewpoint towards a more global one. When I saw Trump give his speech, I wasn't terrified. I was bemused. It's like very bizarre the way that he talked about Elon, a new star is born. And then like the UFC guy comes up there and it's like he smiled because the UFC guy was like, "You're great, boss." And I'm like, I was already looking at these things from the outside, like these people are weird.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, the journeys that you and I have taken. I completely understand and empathize with the journey you've taken. And I'm completely mystified and surprised at where I've ended up, which is not how I imagined I would be. I mean, I was a Brit through and through. But here I am. America is such a huge place. When I go to West Virginia, or a month ago, I was in South Carolina for a baseball tournament, and Europe just seems a very, very long way away. And Ukraine seems a very long, long way away. And I kind of get it, how different the world seems when you're an American. It's just a different perspective.
I'm going to pivot to another question. I'm going to allow a Trump voter who is not American, but a Trump supporter to ask something because I feel like we sometimes have an echo chamber on the pod. This is from a Danish entrepreneur, one of the most dynamic business people I know. He wrote me, "Go Bitcoin, go RFK to demolish the corrupt pharma industrial complex, and go Elon to slash the bureaucracy, make the country efficient, which creates deflation and progress. Go Trump to end the wars in the world. I have big expectations and I expect them to deliver." I don't, but when you have intelligent people, particularly an intelligent Scandinavian, you have to take seriously this. They did a poll among Europeans who would be the most likely to vote for Harris versus Trump. And Denmark was the country where there were the least number of Trump voters per population. And like Slovakia within the EU was the one that had the most. So how would you respond to this kind of optimism that the administrative state will be fixed and that Trump will fix it?
So I think we could end up in a situation where if Elon Musk does take charge of this government restructuring, it won't be a restructuring that results in better government. It will be a politically orientated restructuring that strips out people who care about environmental regulations or about health and safety regulations or consumer product regulations. It will be a ideologically driven strimming of the bureaucracy that will leave American products, American businesses less clear on regulations. I mean, here's a very interesting analogy, actually, with the UK and Brexit, which is that the Conservatives promised this bonfire of all this red tape and EU regulations. And at last, now we're out of the EU. We don't need any of these regulations. And it was actually Kemi Badenoch as Trade Secretary who finally understood that that would leave businesses completely at limbo with no structure and no formulation and parameters for how they were supposed to design their products. And they might not be able to sell their products into the EU if they got rid of all these regulations. And so she abandoned that attempt. And so I think they will try and strim the bureaucracy, and there'll be an initial cheering, yay, we're sort of cutting out government waste and fat. And actually, businesses will find it harder to operate in that environment, and it won't work as well as they think it will. And it'll be a very ideologically driven exercise rather than looking at how can we really streamline the bureaucracy and make it more efficient. So I spent 2 years working on an exchange program in the State Department. And yeah, the bureaucracy was kind of mind-blowing. The British Foreign Office stripped and stripped and stripped down to the bones the administrative side of how the Foreign Office was run. And State Department just had masses of officials. Every regional bureau had its own front desk, its own reception, its own human resources team, its own finance team. I mean, it was massive. the sheer number of staff. And I feel you could strip that down.
Except Tillerson tried that and it didn't work. Of course, the State Department has too many people. Rex Tillerson, Secretary Tillerson came in initially and he said, I'm going to cut 20% of the budget here and get rid of 25% of your jobs. But he didn't succeed.
There is a bureaucracy to be stripped down, but this will be an ideologically motivated one. So for your friend in Denmark, they will cheer, yeah, we're cutting down the bureaucracy, but it won't work in the way he thinks it will. And then they're going to put in these loyalists to replace a lot of these federal jobs who know absolutely nothing about the subjects and the policy issues that they are now in charge of. And it's not going to work well.
Yep. So as a counterpoint, I have from a family friend the following question, quote, Trump is going to be told by his billionaire friends that we can't get rid of the illegals. We need them for meat and chicken production, home care, gardening. What's going to happen is the billionaire class will create a system of quasi-indentured servitude. And as more services are outsourced, they will use these indentured services via private equity arrangements to make money on selling labor. The U.S. will become like Russia, a kleptocracy, as previously public functions will be privatized under the Project 2025 mantra of private enterprise being more efficient. Trump can eliminate things like AccuWeather, and then people have to pay money for the weather. Trump will ensure that his new companies, Trump Media and his Bitcoin business, suck in money from foreigners who want to cultivate his favor. And when it comes to healthcare, he's going to eliminate the ACA and 30 million people will lose health insurance. And the plebes are just going to be watching reality TV and The Masked Singer. So the question is to you, Alex Haw. In a world where no one should be a billionaire and tax structures need to tax people to create fairness because inequality creates resentment and inefficiency, where do we go from here?
Wow. The word that came to mind is enshittification of services. I don't like the word, but you used it to describe the gradual takeover of services and then the stripping of them and the running down of them until they no longer work. But because they have monopolies, you end up having to rely upon those services and they don't work as well. That may not be exactly how it works, but it's that sense. So yes, I am very worried about the billionaire tech moguls and supporters of Trump and how they may damage the institutions of the state, privatize a lot of the functions, and enshittify them and worsen them. The inequality issue is one that I find quite mystifying in the US. A lot of the people who support Trump don't seem to resent billionaires. They seem to admire them. There doesn't seem to be that same anger about inequality that I think hits us in Europe. You're shaking your head, so I'll let you come back on that one. Let me finish on the last one. The deportation issue. I mean, just logistically, it is not feasible to deport millions and millions of people. That is going to be a logistical nightmare. It's going to lead to very ugly scenes, and there will be a backlash to it. However, I do think it is a big priority of the administration. They are going to pour more resources to the border. The harsh measures will, I think, lead to some people self-deporting. And I think it will deter more people from trying to get into the US. And so I think there will be a reduction in migration. And it was a huge mistake of the Biden administration to roll back so many of the Trump measures in the first 3 years in office. I mean, there was a massive influx of immigrants, and that was a huge mistake, and they're paying a price for that. So you're never going to be able to stop all immigration into the US, but I think there will be an effort to control the border, screen more who is coming in, be tighter on people who entered the country illegally, and drive them underground.
I was shaking my head, not in disagreement, but in thoughts about Bernie. I was a Bernie supporter. I actually advised the campaign, and I think that they could have beaten Hillary in those primaries, and then they would have won the election. Because left-wing populism, to my mind, addresses more what people want. But the problem is that Bernie had to bring on left-wing cultural issues that made it impossible for him to beat Hillary. But if he had been a pure economic populist who cared a little bit about moving to the center on some cultural issues, then I think that he could have won and we wouldn't be in this mess. And when Elon takes over, Elon is now the most powerful man in the world because the incoming president owes him a huge, huge, huge favor and is going to appoint him to whatever job he wants. I mean, Elon doesn't want to be Secretary of State, but if he did, he'd get it. And then he can use that job to make X and SpaceX and whatever richer because he sells services to the very government that he's going to be working for. And if we had had Sanders, we wouldn't be in this mess because it would have been the break 'em up, the Elizabeth Warren attack, the antitrust hammer on Facebook and on Twitter and on all these things and break them into tons and tons of pieces so that no agglomeration of power could get to this level. But the reason that Bezos couldn't stomach his paper, the Washington Post, saying that he endorsed Harris, even though personally we know that he didn't want Trump to win, is because he sells billions and billions of dollars of Amazon Web Services to the government. And because he has, the government requires Amazon logistics and he competes for contracts. And he knows that Trump is a vengeful bastard and he will cut him out of those contracts because the reality is if you have a system where power is intending to concentrate and concentrate and concentrate, and then that requires access to government, the more powerful people become, the more they have to kiss the ass of the ruler. And there's some kind of connection. And that's what fascism is. It's a relationship between the lumpen proletariat and a corporatist elite. The corporatist elite in Germany connected with the lumpen proletariat to skip out the middle classes. And the reason why Jews were such a threat is the Jews were not the high-end elites in German business. They were all German Catholics and Protestant, the real top dogs who owned Bayer and who owned the Krupp manufacturer. They were Christians. And then the most of the working class, the people who were working in the factories and doing the regular jobs and serving the army, they were regular German Christians. But in the middle class of lawyers and doctors and professors, Jews were very overrepresented. And fascism was an arrangement between the corporatist uber elites and the working lumpen proletariat to skip out the middle. And that's what I think is happening now that I alluded to in the other episode. And that's the social class that is being enveloped from the corporatist elites in the top and the lumpen proletariat from the bottom. And I think all of us in the educated globalist middle, we are going to be squeezed and screwed. The very nature of this system is that we are now, Alex, you and I, we are the class enemy of the ruling regime. And the reality is I've already run for the hills in Hampstead, and I have created an underground bunker there, Alex. I don't know if you noticed.
You keep saying you're running to the hills in Hampstead. Every time you say that, it makes me laugh. The hills of Hampstead are like your safe North London liberal establishment that these people like to pillory. You have to run for the hills of Appalachia. I'm running to the hills, the Blue Ridge Mountains.
But they'll find you there, Alex.
Yeah, but I'll be wearing camo and listening to bluegrass music. I'll be blending in.
Aha. Do you really think that when they hear your accent, they won't know?
So when I first moved to West Virginia, I remember one of our neighbors, who was a lovely guy, he would look at my husband and go, "What's she saying? What's she saying?" He didn't understand. My accent was too strong. So I think I'm safe. I want to come back to this issue about how do we survive. I thought President Macron made a good point yesterday. He was a leader who spoke very well. He said, look, the Americans voted for what they see as in the American interest. Europeans need to do what we think is in our interest. So the other angle to this is Europe needs to get its bloody act together. We can't rely upon America buttressing NATO anymore. That is absolutely clear. I've been quite struck by the number of people who say, oh, but will America withdraw from NATO? No, America doesn't have to withdraw from NATO. You just have to have an element of doubt as to whether America will actually come to the aid of a NATO country. And Donald Trump's already said he might not. If they're not paying their fair share, he might not. So Europe needs to get its act together.
I want that to happen. Sadly, because of the enduring disorder, I don't think they will, because the French and Italians don't look at the issue the same way. And the British have a different view about Ukraine than the Germans. You know what I mean? I'd love to see it happening, But what we've seen even since the Ukraine war is a splintering of the core European allies. So I wrote in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, if this crisis was not existential enough to get the Europeans all on the same page and creating collective defense, then Putin will reinvade Ukraine, and it still won't be enough. And therefore, despite the fact that he did reinvade Ukraine and that now Trump is ensconced as essentially the king of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we are not going to see a situation where all of a sudden Ursula von der Leyen is able to get every European country to support the same proposals.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that the German government has collapsed overnight. You know, they're going to tear themselves apart over this. Populist and right-wing movements across Europe are going to be emboldened. We're recording this episode just after very nasty incidents in Amsterdam where groups of, well, it's still too soon to know the full details, but suffice to say, visiting Israelis supporting the Israeli football team were attacked in a very nasty and brutal way. And I think we're going to see more of this ugliness spilling out across the streets of Europe. And already Geert Wilders is saying, see, this shows we need to kick these Muslim immigrants out. I think we're going to see more of those polarizing cultural issues. I do want to note for the record that, I mean, what happened in Amsterdam last night is horrific and chilling for all Jewish people everywhere. Apparently, some of those Israeli fans were chanting a song celebrating the killing of Palestinian children, which possibly was not wise.
I've heard that too, but the pogrom aspect of chasing around the Jewish fans and beating them with clubs and stuff, yes, chilling. I think that, again, these are aspects of the enduring disorder whereby we are all being reduced to our class and religious and ethnic identities and pitted against each other. Because we're getting to a place where it's like, these people have taken my job. You know what I mean? And the stigmatization of that is an us versus them, when the reality is that a prosperous America, it needs lots of immigrants and it needs this kind of labor and that kind of labor, and we're all in it together. And the positive spirit is that the rising tide will lift all boats. The Trumpian message is not that. It is a zero sum or negative sum. We need to take back what someone else took from us. And I mean, this is a dark place to end the episode. These kind of outrages, for lack of a better term, I think are quite in vogue with the spirit of the enduring disorder, which is to see another group as inherently stealing from you, taking your thing, and worthy of either being killed or beaten or somehow demonified.
It's a very depressing note to end the episode on, but I do fear we are already seeing the ramifications of Donald Trump's re-election.
So, Alex, given this, I don't think I should be stigmatized for running for the hills of Hampstead, because it's a place where I see Persians and Arabs and Jews and subcontinentals and Brits whose parents can trace their lineage to the Normans, all mixing together and all happy and all interacting. So I actually want to be safe in the hills of Hampstead.
Well, I wish you safety in your ivory tower in Hampstead. I will be going to West Virginia this weekend, and I will be wearing camo and listening to bluegrass and trying to blend in and avoid upsetting anybody.
You blend in very well, Alex.
I naturally come across totally American. So thank you, everyone, for listening to us. I'm sorry that this has been quite a dark episode. We have to hold on to the values. We have to believe in democracy and believe that we can make a change. Let's see how this plays out. Jason and I will be coming back to these issues over and over again. But I do feel, Jason, you deserve credit for launching a podcast called Disorder. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you to our producer, George McDonough. I hope you have a safe week. Take a deep breath. Square your shoulders. Don't get mad. Get going. Get out there. Don't give up.
Don't get mad, get going. Thank you also to our executive producer, Neil Fern. We would never leave you out, Neil. And we would never leave you, the mega orderers, out, because we know that we need each other and we are a community. You are all welcome to burrow underneath the hills of Hampstead with me. Just drop me a line.
That's enough from you. That's enough from me. Bye, Jason.
Bye-bye.